I'm going to talk a bit about animations in React Native. I've now thought of a better title for this talk. So it's Animations in React Native, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Love Native UX. My name is Jamie. This is me. I exist under my full name on the internet, on GitHub and my almost never used Twitter, and I work for Tech Will Save Us, and we make toys that kids can build and code themselves, kind of STEM toys, tech toys, stuff like this, and we have a digital experience that goes alongside our physical product, and that's what I work on. And a part of that is some React Native apps. And I'm going to start by picking up on something that Joe was talking about, and that's about what makes a native app feel native, and how does React Native fit into that. And so I was thinking about the kind of things that mean, why would we use a native app over just making a website? And I thought like maybe one reason is we want offline capabilities. Up until very recently, we haven't been able to do anything offline with a website. And so if we wanted that, we'd need a native app. Or maybe if we wanted to use some device hardware like Bluetooth or the camera or something like this, again, up until very recently, you just couldn't do this with web. And even now, it's very flaky and only works in Chrome. And then another one I was thinking a bit more of a kind of philosophical difference is that a native app knows what it looks like before it's fetched any data from anywhere. The layout is baked in, and on web, everything, every single byte that we see has to be fetched from a server somewhere. And then I started thinking about how we use native apps. And so, for example, you get gestures on a native app, and you don't tend to see gestures so much on web. Maybe you have something swipeable, but it's kind of unusual, and it's pretty hard to get touch stuff right. And in the same vein, maybe it's animations. Animations on web are really quite difficult. We can do CSS animations, but anything more complex and more interactive than that, you don't really see very often. And I think it's these last two that I'm really interested in, because these aren't kind of factual differences, but they're differences in how we experience a native app. And certainly before I came to hybrid app development, I know there was a reputation for hybrid apps having a bad feel. Maybe they would have all of the elements that a native app would have, but they would just feel kind of clunky and not right, and there would be something about them that wouldn't have the weight that maybe a native app would have. And so I think it's a really fair question to ask that, is this where React Native falls down? You've got all the components that you might want, but maybe the feel that you get, the performance could be great, but just that way that you interact with it might not be as good. And I think absolutely not. React Native's key achievement over any other hybrid app development framework that I've seen is that this kind of thing, gestures, interactions, and animations, can be really easily achieved at a really, really high level. And I think actually a lot of the reason that there's this bad rap for hybrid apps is because of how we come to them. I was a web developer who got hired by a company that wanted to make a React Native app, and none of us had any idea what we were doing when we started. And we started making it like web developers. And web developers might be really good at a CSS hover animation, but any interaction more complicated than that, we just don't really know how to do it. Whereas native developers, on the other hand, they have these really heavy-duty APIs that come with the tools that they're using. And more importantly, I think they have a cultural expectation in that Google's material design guidelines and Apple's human interface guidelines spend a lot of time talking about the importance of gestures and interactions and touch. And web, you come to React Native, and the docs are great, but there's nobody telling you that this is how you should be doing things. And so I really want to impress this idea that animation in native apps, whether they're React Native or not, is not a luxury. And I'm not saying that in that I think you have to do them, you have to suffer for them because they're essential. They're not a luxury because they're actually really easy when you're using React Native. And you can get an app that feels really good through the tools that you're given without very much work. And now I'm just going to kind of go through how you might build up some basic animations in React Native. And so you start with something very similar to what Joe showed us. It's just a really simple screen that renders an alien in this case. a view is like a div, as he said, text is like a span. This is pretty straightforward, and now we can start and think about how you might animate this. And then the core of animations in React Native are these objects called animated values. These kind of perform a bit of magic in that they can bind to the underlying variables in native views and change them directly. So the performance problems that you would get if you were changing JavaScript variables that were then having to go through Facebook's bridge code and then back out 100 times a second, you don't have to deal with that with animated values because they can kind of bypass this bridge mechanism that Facebook provide. And so we start off with our animation. We just put an animated value in the state and give it an initial value of 0. And then we want to hook that up to what we've got. And all we do there is we swap out the view we were using with an animated view, which is just a view that can take advantage of these optimizations that I've mentioned. And then we define a style. Styles Joe touched on, they're a little bit weird when you first look at them in React Native, but they're pretty easy. Transforms are a little bit strange. You give them an array of objects that define the transformations. But styles in React Native, I think there's an almost perfect oversimplification. And pretty much every day when I'm working on React Native, I'll guess at something and it'll be wrong and I'll get an error. But that wrongness comes from when this is wrong, which is very, very rare. And you just use CSS properties and you make them camel cased. And you can only use Flexbox. And maybe one of the best things as a web dev coming to React Native is that you don't have to worry about Internet Explorer compatibility. You can always use Flexbox, and it always works exactly how you want it to. So going back to the React Native code, I've just added a button in because we need something to start the animation off. And when this button's pressed, it calls a function on the class that we're in called animate. And this is what that looks like. Where we use another function off React Native's animated API called timing. Timing takes a duration and an end value and an animated value that you want to mutate. That's that. You define that animation and then you start it. So here I've said, let's animate that value from 0, how I initialized it, to 350, and it'll take 800 milliseconds. And that looks something like this. This is very basic. This is not great native UX, but this is a good building block. You'll notice that it is easing. Bizarrely, for reasons I don't understand, Facebook put easing on animations by default. The number of bugs that throws up, I'd be quite interested to know. And so now we've set this up, we can go on to exciting stuff really easily. So for me, when I got into animations, the next question is, this is all very well, but if I have to do that code that I just went through for every value that I want to animate, that's an awful lot of boilerplate. But actually, there's a really nice way around that, and it's something that Facebook, I apologize, the line breaks have gone quite strange there. Facebook have come up with called interpolate. And if any of your web developers who've used D3 before, this is like scales in D3. And here we're saying, we're translating y, moving in vertical direction like we were before, but we also want to move in the x direction. And rather than a whole new animated value, we just say we know that the original value is going between 0 and 350, but we only want to move it between 0 and 200. And that's super easy. And we get diagonal movement, and that's great. We can translate, but we can also use interpolations for other things. So opacity is really easy to achieve. And you can see here that the output range is kind of upside down compared to the input range, but it's fine, it can do that. And you can start to piece these things together with a few animated values and timing functions on them. You can start to build like really quite significant, you can really build quite significant UIs. And I'm using the wrong version of the slides, so I am going to have to I apologize. So back to where I was. I've done something wrong. I apologize. There was a video of what you can achieve with these animated values here, but it has disappeared. So you are not going to get to see that. It was extremely impressive, though, I can assure you. But even then, this isn't interaction, and interaction is what I started off talking about. And interaction in React Native, this is something I will concede. I think it's easy, but the API is really terrifying. It uses these things called pan responders, which I think is related to the naming of the underlying native code. I don't really understand what most of the pan responder code means, but you don't really need to. This first bit on start should set pan responder returns true. I have no idea what that means. But on pan responder move is the important bit. It's meaning when the thing is being touched, this function gets called. And then again, a really weird API, this animated event thing. I can't remember what null is replacing there, but the key bit is that on the movement event, we're binding dy, the change in vertical position of the touch, to our animated value. And then the really amazing thing is then this binding our animated value to the touch, we can actually use the same code that we had before and get really satisfying effects. The pan responder gives you a load of props that you can use. Again, you don't have to know what they are. You just spread those onto the component. And then this happens straight away, the same code as before. And we can use the same interpolations as before. We have the opacity effect. And then you can get really interesting, and you can start to see how things would turn into a native app that you might use. So let's say we want something to happen when you let go. So there's another pan responder function on pan responder release. And here I'm using the spring function, which is a sort of vaguely physical spring. I think it's how the chat heads on Facebook Messenger work. And this is just saying when you release, animate this value to 0, behaving like a spring over 250 milliseconds. And this, I really like this example because you can see how this is a bit like pull to refresh, but you can see how this kind of movement would come up in the kind of app that you would want to build, and would have that native feel. And there's a pretty huge toolbox of things available. You can stagger animations, you can run them in parallel, you can run them sequentially. There are loads of different easing functions. There are springs, you can decay values to 0. And there's more than this. There's a lot of stuff that basically, if you can think of how you would compose an animation out of these values moving between other values, Facebook will provide you with a function that can do that. And this, I think potentially is actually the video that I wanted to show you. I just forgot what order it came in. This is a nice example of something that we built at Tech Will Save Us. So we have a product called the Dough Universe, and the Dough Universe comes with an app that kids can, is kind of an interactive manual. And in the Dough Universe, there's an evil character, Dr. Drydough, and he's really angry because he's made of Play-Doh, but he's dried out, so he's no longer conductive. And all of the other dough creatures are having a great time, and they're playing with all this tech because they're conductive. But he can't do any of it, and so he grows up spiteful, and he decides to ruin the Dough Universe and take the tech away from the dough creatures. But you, the owner of our kits, can rescue the universe. And so this is how you might start off. And every animation you see here is built basically using what I just showed you. So And so more on what's after the loading screen later, but I think it's quite fun how much you can get from just springing a few things around makes everything feel a lot more fun. And so yeah, I just want to touch on what if you want to do stuff that is beyond these basic animations. I have claimed that these helper functions will get you anything you want. I think we probably all know that that's not quite true. What if you want really custom stuff? The designers have made something beautiful in After Effects, and they insist that it needs to look exactly like this. And so there's a tool which I'm a big fan of called Lottie from Airbnb. If you've used Body Moving on the web before, it's the same. They've now rebranded Body Moving to Lottie for web. And Lottie takes files from After Effects, and I have no idea how it does it, but it turns those into close to native performance animations. And Airbnb gives some really cute examples of the kind of things that you can do. And I really like this. I think this is something that goes back to my original point that a native app, that the weight of feel that you get with it is a lot down to the delight that you get from interacting with it. And I think these animations are really beautiful. And the fact that we can do those in a hybrid app that we've written in JavaScript and that runs on Android and iOS is absolutely amazing. And we can take Lottie to an extreme that it really wasn't designed to do. But again, it's stuff that designers have made in After Effects and then can run perfectly on iOS and Android. And this is what you see after the loading screen on Do Universe. And this is in the jungle of one of the planets. And this planet, they've lost, the Do creatures have lost their ability to use light. And you're helping them make some light machines. And this is all from Lottie. So that's a taster of that. You can actually, this is free on the App Store. If you search for it, you'll be able to play with this. But I just think that's a nice example of the level to which you can go with native animations and the things you can achieve that you just wouldn't be able to achieve on web. And these things are not only doable in React Native, but really, really quite easy and quite fun to do. And so that's that from me. And I have, you can kind of go through the examples from this talk on an Expo app that's in that repository and see the slides. So have a go with it. Thank you.
Hello. Jamie, thank you very much indeed. That was brilliant. Has anyone got any questions for Jamie?
Hi. You mentioned that that Facebook have enabled easing just by default for no real reason. Are there any other kind of random little things that we need to know about before we get into this?
That's one of the ones that really sticks in my mind because the way Lottie works is it means it plays, if you follow the docs, well, before I made a pull request to change this, it would play all of your animations with easing, which caused us some really interesting problems. That is perhaps the weirdest one. It's a good question. And something that I totally agree with what Joe said is that the developer experience in React Native has got an awful lot better over the last year. I think I first did React Native development about 18 months ago, and it was terrible because 80% of the time was spent having to know stuff like this, having to know which order to clean caches in to get something to restart. On the whole, I think it's improving. Of course, this is something that's probably going to be a breaking change if they change it back, but it's much more standardized. And so, yes, there are things. I'm afraid they don't spring to mind, but they are decreasing by the day.
Thank you.
Hey, other than Lottie, have you got any other recommendations for other libraries and stuff for animation?
Yep. So if you're interested in doing kind of very basic stuff, which is just say spinning or moving or draggable, that you don't really need that much configurability with, there's a library called React Native Animatable. I think the guy who made that his GitHub is called Oblador. He also made a really very good library for doing vector icons in React Native. So those are much more declarative than what I've showed you, which is quite imperative. And I guess as a React developer that you would start off being a bit suspicious of. I'm fine with it, obviously. React Native Animatable is much more, you would just say animatable view that spins and it does it. So yeah, I'd recommend that for the more basic stuff.
Great. Any more? Are there any tweening libraries?
Tweening libraries?
Like you can just specify like the beginning, the end, and a few points in between. And
yeah, no, basically. It's not that I've come across. Yeah. It's a shame. I guess you get around this by just telling designers to do stuff in After Effects, and then they send you the files. But, yeah.
There you go. With Lottie. Right?
Yeah.
You can do it with Lottie.
Yeah.
You can set like start at this frame and end at this frame.
Yeah.
Between these frames.
Yeah.
Cool. Any more questions? Good. Okay. Thank you very much, Jamie. It was brilliant. We're going to break for what? Oh, no,